November 12, 1942. Richmond Shipyard, number 2, California. The morning fog rolled in from the bay like breath from a sleeping giant, beating on helmet brims and the hot, scaly hide of new welded plate. Floodlights burned through the mist, harsh and white, catching sparks that leapt and died in the air. On the ways sat an impossible rumor turned real. A 441-foot Liberty ship, hull form accused cone, rivet heads still warm, paint barely dry. Workers in peacoats and oil-stained overalls crowded the railings. Swing shift, graveyard, day crew all jammed together. Somewhere under the clatter of chain falls and the bark of foremen's whistles, a timekeeper checked the ledger. 4 days, 15 hours, and change. Mabel Ortega, a welder with a red bandana knotted over her hair, wrung her gloves and breathed steam into the cold. She was 22, daughter of a stevedore from Veracruz, and the staccato cough of a portable arc set was as natural to her now as her father's stories of the Gulf. Beside her, a pipefitter from Oklahoma thumbed a tobacco pouch and muttered, "Never seen the like." Someone answered, "You're seeing it now." At the head of the ways, a foreman raised a bullhorn. The dockside siren rose and held, a note of warning and celebration all at once. They named her Robert E. Peary, and when the triggers blew and the dog shores kicked, the hull slid. First stubbornly, then with ocean hunger. Down greased timbers into the water with a thunder that shook the knees. "We'll make them agree." And the human. At the wire fence, a boy showed his father, new to California, new to everything, a paper with a photograph of a convoy under air cover, tiny ships in winter water, tinier planes guarding. "It says they're beating the U-boats," the boy said. The father, hands scarred from sugarcane knives, pockets full of the little stones of a new language, looked past the image to the cranes that swung like metronomes and nodded. "Then we keep." Skepticism did not vanish. It learned to work the same hours as faith. In the weld school, instructors chalked the language of their day: heat-affected zones, notch sensitivity, preheat temperatures. Beside the older words of shipwrights, keelsons, stringers, shear. In the lunchroom, a foreman spread a blueprint on a table sticky with coffee rings and said, "We cut a radius here, we bevel there. The cold can't get its teeth in." A riveter in a Navy peacoat washed, thumb worrying a scar on his hand, and finally grunted what passed for surrender. "Yeah, as long as she floats." Still the clock beat. At dawn, a tug spat exhaust and nosed a new hull toward the outfitting pier. It was not the 4-day miracle of the Peary. Not yet. Not with steel late and inspectors fussy and welders learning the river instead of the fishbone. But the ways were moving. A rhythm. Ragged but gathering, like a train climbing grade. Down on the deck of a half-born ship, Mabel chipped slag and listened to the metal cool, the little clicks like ice in a glass. The bow knifed the gray, a white lip of spray leapt up, and the ship settled, already tug nudged toward the outfitting pier. She thought of the men at sea, and of the photograph in her locker, and of her father's hands, and of the tanker that split in the cold. She laid her next bead with the patience of prayer. Outside the gate, the rain slackened. In a few hours, the next shift would come through, badges out, lunch pails thumping, 100 accents braided into one long work song. Somewhere in the fog, a U-boat captain would raise his periscope and see a freighter where last month there had been none. March 8, 1943. Richmond Shipyard, number 2, plate shop. Steam drifted off the sheets like breath from horses. A new machine, ugly, brilliant, rattled on stubby wheels, dragging a hose that pulsed like an artery. "Preheat cart," the instructor shouted over the clang. 200 degrees before you start your bead. Cold steel shatters. Warm steel forgives. He chalked a circle on the edge of a hatch opening, sharp corner, and scrubbed it out with a radius template. No more knife points for the ocean to bite. The lesson was not theory. It came with the smell of hot iron and the memory of ships that had complained in winter. Mabel wiped her eyes with her sleeve, surprised to find them wet. Mabel Ortega held a soapstone and traced curves where once she would have drawn squares. Change arrived like that, piecemeal, practical, irresistible. Inspectors' mirrors now hung on lanyards beside spud wrenches. Caulkboards sprouted in every bay, neat columns of names and times under headings like fit, tack, burn, wire, and test. Foremen tapped the boxes with knuckles and made decisions in pencil rather than in the air. On the ways, pylons wore fresh stenciling. Block 4 port, Block 4 starboard, arrows fat and idiot-proof. A sheet metal man smirked. "We're building ships for the blind." The planner with the pencil behind his ear didn't look up. "We're building them for the clock." March 23rd. In the weld school, a Navy metallurgy officer in khaki told a room of civilians that the ocean was not a metaphor but a laboratory. He spoke softly, as if repeating a catechism. Heat affected zone, notch sensitivity, grain growth. Then he set down his pointer and picked up a hammer. Pride, yes, but also a question she did not say out loud. Could they keep doing this? He tapped a fillet weld once, twice, and the ring that came back was clean. "You hear that?" he asked. "That's a sound we can send to Murmansk." The old riveters watched from the doorway like men standing on the platform as a new train came in. The one from Mare Island, sleeves cut short to accommodate a permanent heat, nodded toward the cart that warmed the steel. "That," he allowed, "I can respect." He stepped in, shrugged, and showed a boy how to hold a chipping hammer so his wrist wouldn't betray him at 60. The Kaiser clinics expanded with the pace, 3 white buildings smelling of iodine and new paint. Posters on the walls read, "Stay fit to fight," even if your weapon is a torch. Doctors in rolled shirt sleeves stitched cuts and set sprains. In a quieter room, a woman with a stethoscope listened to lungs roughened by flux smoke and signed a pass that read, "Mask the whole job." Across the way, a nursery rocked with a sea of small, sleeping ships. Cots, each with a name pinned to the rail. Rosie, Eduardo, May. Their parents' shifts posted on a chalkboard like sailing orders. Henry Kaiser walked through at noon, hat in hand, and lingered over a child with hair like copper shavings. "We're not just stealing time," he said to the nurse. "We're buying it back." April 2nd, a first flying squad arrived on the ways at a run. 6 welders, 2 fitters, a pipeman, an electrician carrying a canvas roll of tools. Could anybody? Because beyond the fog and the bridges and the cranes, beyond San Pablo Bay and the corduroy of Victory Gardens, men in black steel tubes were writing numbers in the dark Atlantic. They were a yard within the yard, a fix-it brigade for bottlenecks. If a block didn't marry its neighbor, they dogged, jacked, and whispered it into shape. If a seam tested dirty, they ground silver sparks into the air and laid it in clean. Their lead wore a white stripe on his hard hat and a stopwatch around his neck. "We live between the boxes on the chalkboard," he told Mabel. "That's where schedules go to die." Schedules, though, were beginning to live. The Gantt charts, those tight combs of ink lines on paper, stopped looking like scribbles and started sounding like a hymn. Station 1's average fell by 5 minutes. Station 6 lost 12. The rail spur began delivering plate on rhythm instead of hope. Fitters learned the trick of kissing 2 blocks together with hydraulic presses instead of prayers. U-boats, in wolf packs, hunted freighters by the moon and by the shape of silhouettes, torpedoes scribbling fire along the waterline. An outfitter with a sense of the dramatic staged a rehearsal for installing a deck gun foundation. No gun present, only chalk marks and a chorus of hands. A clock on the bulkhead ticked so loudly it could have been naval discipline. April 19th. On a gray afternoon that tasted like salt, a Liberty slid off the ways and bumped the tug like a new foal into a fence. Her name was ordinary, Oakwood, or something as American, and she felt less like a miracle and more like the proof that miracles could be scheduled. Mabel stood with a paper cup of coffee and watched the tug's posture and push. The foreman's board showed numbers that would once have been brag and were now baseline. He closed it with a palm and grunted as if to himself. Again? The skepticism hadn't vanished. It had changed uniforms. Now it wore clipboards and asked whether the human machine could hold this pace. The yard answered with lanes painted on concrete, with lunch breaks that arrived to the minute with a union steward who could recite the names of every man and woman on the graveyard shift by memory and grievance. When a pay shortage flared into a near strike at Base 7, the steward and the boss met at midnight under a crane that loomed like a gallows. Voices rose, then lowered. The checks came right 3 days later. Nobody forgot how close they'd come. In 1942, ship sinking sometimes outrun ship birth. "We don't have a day to spare," the steward said to his crew. "Not here. Not out there." Meanwhile, out there arrived in the yard as mail. A letter crumpled, sea-wet, bearing a censor scar where words had been cut out like tumors. A kid from Oklahoma unfolded it on a locker bench and read aloud. "We had 3 escorts in one of those damn baby carriers overhead. Planes all day. Didn't see a periscope. We saw the ice. A hand-drawn map showed a place that looked like the roof of the world. They stacked us like bricks in the hold," another letter said. "I never knew flour could be heavy enough to save a man." May 1943. The bay put a hand on spring, warmer and bright as burnished plate. Word came over the radio in the planning shed, voices tight with official understatement. U-boat losses high. Convoys through. May is black for them. The foreman switched it off and stared at the blank face of the set as if it had spoken a prayer. Nobody danced. Welding arcs sparked. Cranes groaned. The flying squad jogged past at a dog trot. Every liberty that did not exist yet was a convoy missing a lifeline. Mabel felt it, though, in her shoulders, the weight that had been riding there since winter turning, not light, but shareable. The turning point was not a single shout or siren. It was 100 small decisions pushed to habit. It was the preheat card humming, the hatch corners rounded, the inspector's hammer singing true. It was the clinics open late and the nursery lights steady and the chalkboards with fewer air ushers. It was a riveter admitting, grudging and real, that a weld could hold in February. It was the proof that you could teach a city to keep time with an ocean. On a night shift under a sky like hammered tin, Mabel finished a seam and lifted her mask. The metal clicked as it cooled, the little sounds like distant applause. She looked down the length of a half-built ship toward the water that waited, inscrutable and hungry. The yard's clocks all said the same thing now. For the first time, she believed they could keep them honest. May 26, 1943, North Atlantic, 30 degrees west of Ireland. G. Night pressed on the water like a black hand. Every day a hull waited on the ways meant fuel, flour, and shells that never reached the front. Henry J. A convoy moved through it in careful geometry. Columns of freighters at 8 knots, escorts pacing the perimeter like wolves with better manners. The Liberty John Stagg wrote her place, number 4 in column 3. A boxy silhouette with a stern gun squatting under canvas and oarlike 20 muns bristling like thorns along her rails. On her bridge, a Navy-armed guard ensign watched the weight curl and tried not to think about what might be following it. On the fosse, a seaman counted the seconds between sighs of the sea and the soft click of blackout lamps. Somewhere in the hold, under cargo nets and dunnage, sacks of flour nested beside crates of shells and wooden cases stenciled with gasoline warnings. The ship smelled of rope and salt and the ghosts of oranges. The first flare tore the sky open, a magnesium flower that turned the ocean to hammered silver. "Star shell astern," the armed guard gun captain barked, already ducking his head. The convoy reacted like a school of fish. White wakes knifed. Signal lamps winked in a code that felt faster than human thought. From outboard came the hungry ping of an escort sonar, the working sound of men flinging mathematics into dark water. Depth charges went over in pairs, rolling from racks, and falling with the untidy grace of stones. Kaiser walked the yard with a notebook tucked under his arm and his hat tugged low against the wet. Seconds later the sea lifted, as if a giant had been startled awake underneath it. Somewhere out there, a U-boat captain listened to his hull sing and made a decision too complicated for courage alone. The Stag's stern crew stripped the canvas off the 4-inch and squinted into the night. "See anything?" someone asked, because someone always asked. "Only water," the gun captain answered, because that was faith and discipline both. Far off, a shape cut black across black, the low bridge and long deck of something that did not belong on the surface except to kill, and run. A destroyer cracked onto flank speed, bow throwing white. A line of hedgehog rounds went into the dark, 36 little black seeds arcing in silence. The convoy held its course behind its escorts, like a prayer behind a priest. In the Stag's radio room, the operator tuned to a whisper of Britain and caught a clipped voice announcing bearings, then another voice. American young pleased, talking about huff duff and triangulation. The operator smiled despite himself. They can hear them calling each other on the air, he thought. They're finding wolves by the sound of how they talk. He was not a shipbuilder by pedigree. He built roads, dams, dreams with rebar. Above the convoy, a shape announced itself with a grumble. Not a bomber, but one of the new angels, long-legged patrol planes that could stay up all day. The distant gleam of a ley light under its belly waiting for a periscope to betray a glint. Dawn came like a tired apology, a gray light that turned the sea to pewter and showed no more enemies, only foam scars where charges had been. The little carrier off the beam, a so-called baby flat-top, swung to wind. A pair of squat Avengers came down the deck and grew small, wings glinting with slick, purposeful hope. On the Stag, men took off helmets and rubbed faces lined by salt. A quartermaster made coffee that tasted like gun oil, and everybody said it was perfect. The Liberty kept 8 steady knots into a west wind. In Richmond, the proof announced itself differently. A V-mail letter, shrunken photograph of ink and longing, arrived at the yard post office and found its way to a bulletin board. It had been written on a mess table that pitched in the night, words crowded to keep them from falling off. Tell the welders the seam at frame 52 is a beauty. We heard the escorts had a party last night. We slept. A ship that sleeps is a good ship. Men and women clumped around and read it twice. But he had made a promise to time itself. Tear it into pieces, arrange the pieces on rails, and feed them through men and women until a ship came out the other side. Someone tacked up a snapshot beside it. A Liberty stir and wake like a white road under a cold sky, the kind of picture that told more than it showed. June 1st, Liverpool. The convoy nosed into a river wearing its battle face. Paint scoured, bow a little proud with dried salt, guns tucked like dogs under tables. Dock cranes reached out like iron hands. Barrage balloons floated fat and self-satisfied in the clouds. Stevedores in flat caps swarmed. MPs shouted to nobody in particular. A band somewhere tried to play The Stars and Stripes Forever and made it sound like coal smoke. The Stag banged her lines to bollards and settled, and a hatch cover came off with a cough that released the smell of American wheat and grease. On the quay, a boy with a bicycle watched with the solemnity of a priest. He waved. The boatswain waved back. The cargo moved with the brutal grace of purpose. Slings rising, dripping from holds, cargo nets fat with boxes, cranes talking to each other in the voices of men at levers and brakes. The crate stenciled spare parts. Truck 2-ton kissed the dock and rolled away. Flour sacks found a lorry that would find a bakery that would feed a battalion that would move at night. Barrels thumped. Somewhere, a case-marked radio vanished like magic into an officer's car. The old way, keel up, plate by plate, was too slow for a world on fire. By midnight, the Stag rode higher by inches, and by dawn she was a lighter thing with a deeper purpose. To go back and come again. July 11th, 1943. Gela, Sicily. The sea burned blue. The air burned white. Liberty ships anchored in tight water while smoke walked ashore. Anti-aircraft gunners in steel pots craned for Stukas and swore like poets. LCBPs worried at their sides, taking on jeeps and men and mugs of coffee still hot. Beachmasters with loud voices made a new country out of a strip of sand. A Liberty, not the Stag, another sister, took a bomb that did not detonate and wore it like a flower until a diver with nerve enough to borrow any man's did his work. On the radio, an armed guard gunner's voice sounded older than his face. We keep the cargo moving. And they did. Because by now the yards had taught themselves to schedule courage. Back in Richmond, the Turning Point news had long since quit sounding like a rumor and settled into the numbers on chalkboards. Black May for the U-boats had become black summer. The clinics ran, the nurseries glowed, and the flying squad trotted to wherever somebody else's luck had snagged on a bolt. Here, the sections were born elsewhere. Bow units, sterns, deck houses, bulkheads traveling by flat car, each stamped and numbered, each already threaded with conduit and pipe. Mabel Ortega traced a thumb along a seam and knew its feel as a musician knows a well-tuned string. On her break, she walked to the fence where the bay breathed and read the latest posted list. Departure, arrival, cargo received. It was not poetry. It didn't need to be. August 2nd, mid-Atlantic again. The John Stagg met weather instead of torpedoes, a wall of gray that shoved men to their knees and tried to fold the ship like paper. She groaned, she flexed, she held. Warmed steel forgave, rounded corners let stress slip. Weld sang the one note inspectors prayed for. On the bridge, the ensign drew a gloved hand across the glass and saw fleetingly the glow of another Liberty's running light through the sleet. He thought of the letter on a yard wall, of a name he'd never know under a red bandana breathing steam in a morning fog, and he put the ship 2 degrees into the swell. The convoy kept time. The battlefield test did not end in a trumpet note. It ended, again and again, in arrivals. In a quay under rain, in a beachhead under dust, in a northern harbor where ice looked back with a hard eye. The yard was not a yard so much as an assembly. An orchestra pit where thousands learned each other's cues. On the pier, the smell of wet cedar and hot flux mingled with coffee and paper cups. It ended in men going below to write a line to strangers about frame 52. It ended in a yard whistle that sounded like a ship's horn by mistake and made everyone look up. By the time the Stag turned west for the third round trip, the question that had hung in the air that November morning, "Can we keep this pace?" had been answered without words, in convoys that grew safer by the month and in cranes that never quite slept. September 2nd, 1945. San Francisco Bay. The water was glass, the bridges a pair of ribbons thrown across bright air. Whistles cried from tug to ferry to freighter as if the whole harbor had lungs. In Richmond, men and women drifted toward the gates one last time out of habit more than need. The chalkboards had fewer lines now. The flying squad's toolbox sat closed clean. Mabel Ortega walked to the fence with a lunch pail that suddenly felt theatrical, an object from a play whose last scene had ended. The bay breathed its long, easy breath. Victory had the smell of coffee poured slowly and of machines at rest. Within months, the ways went quiet. The cranes folded their long iron necks. Weld arcs, bright as summer lightning for 3 straight years, became memory. Across America, liberties that had sprinted the Atlantic at 11 honest knots eased into mothball fleets. Tidy rows of gray hulls on quiet rivers, stacked with spare propellers and stories. The tug belched and took the Peary by the hip. Some would return for Korea, shouldering war's weight again without complaint. Many would never leave those anchorages except one last time, to the breakers' torches. A few would live stranger second lives, grain ships on standby hulks in remote harbors, dockside dormitories where seagulls held the morning muster. It was an ending without parades, more ledger than legend. And yet the ships had already done the arithmetic that mattered. 2,710 times America and her shipyards had written a line across the water, name, tonnage, destination, and kept it. Kaiser's 4 Richmond yards had launched hundreds of those lines. Proof that schedule could be a weapon, and that a nation could teach itself to keep time with danger. The irony wore a plain face. The homely, boxy freighter built to be disposable had helped win a war by being relentlessly repeatable. Mabel found work, then school. At night she dreamed in weld puddles, the calm oval, the whispering edge where steel softened and allowed itself to change. She married, had a son with eyes the color of hot iron at dusk, and did not tell him every story. History moved on. Jetcon trails, interstate highways, televisions glowing in living rooms where shift whistles no longer set the clocks. A rigger with a sleeve of faded tattoos, anchors, roses, A girl bent in a smile, leaned to Mabel and said, "4 days, kid." Henry Kaiser, who had once walked the ways with his hat pushed low against the fog, kept walking, out of shipbuilding and into an idea he'd tested in the shadow of his cranes. The clinics that had kept the yard on its feet during the race for hulls became a peacetime promise called Kaiser Permanente, an industrial miracle translated into human care. The medicine of speed, prevention, lanes, checklists, a flying squad for crises, became the medicine of patience. Years unspooled. Liberty ships slipped away one by one, their names turning to static on registers. But not all. In Baltimore, the John W. Brown kept her rivets and her pride. In San Francisco, a gray hull with a gentle sheer, SS Jeremiah O'Brien, stayed alive on volunteers' knuckles and stubbornness. Mabel read about her in the paper in 1994, the 50th summer since men had climbed cargo nets into enemy fire. The O'Brien would steam across the Atlantic to the very beaches she had once fed, not as a freighter now, but as a witness. June 6, 1994, English Channel. Wind wrote white on the water. The O'Brien rode easy, as if some old muscle memory remembered convoys and blackout lamps and the dangerous geometry of columns. Veterans in jackets too big for their shoulders stood along her rail with expressions that were not quite smiles. "Next one's 3.5. He laughed, but not entirely as a joke. Mabel, hair silver under a red scarf for the day, felt the deck's familiar, particular rhythm through her shoes. The crowd leaned as one when the Normandy bluffs came up out of the haze, green and ordinary as any coastline. A man near her whispered a name without meaning to. Another man answered by touching the rail. The O'Brien's engine beat slow and proud, a triple expansion heart that had once pushed 11 knots into sleet. In the after-well deck, a docent held up a chalk and marked a bulkhead, frame 52. "People wrote letters about seams like this," he said. "They wrote them to strangers who made them." Mabel laid her palm on the gray paint, and for a second she felt the cool that comes after heat. The metal's tiny, satisfied clicks as it accepts its own strength. Back home, Richmond learned how to keep its past without embalming it. A national historical park took shape where cranes had once shouldered clouds, not to freeze the yard in amber but to let people walk the lanes where clocks had mattered. The child care center, bright windows, tiny cots, became a museum room where a docent explained why a nursery was a war story. In photographs, faces looked up from masks and goggles, equal in goggles, equal in purpose. In the tool sheds, new jigs and fixtures whispered of speed. You could still stand on the pier and smell salt and paint and coffee if you tried. The irony of innovation lingered like a good echo. The Liberty's genius had never been speed alone. It was humility engineered into steel. Corners rounded so cold couldn't bite. Seams prepared so stress had nowhere to hide. Work divided so a city could shoulder it together. The miracle lay not in one 4-day launch that made headlines, but in the unglamorous holiness of again and again until the Atlantic's mathematics broke in the Allies' favor. When the world asked for beauty, the Liberty gave usefulness and survived in memory for it. In the end, history did what it always does. It forgot names and kept the shape. But the shape mattered. It looked like a box with a single screw and a stubborn bow. It sounded like a siren at shift change and a hammer finding a clean ring on a perfect seam. It felt like a deck that could be trusted under boots at night. It tasted of salt, coffee, and the iron breath of a weld. On a fall afternoon years later, Mabel took her grandson to the bay. In the planning rooms, chalkboards bled with arrows and clocks and the bright hum of ideas. Rotate crews on 90-minute beats, pre-fit ladders to bulkheads, weld in place instead of rivet, layout played so a greenhorn could not put it on wrong if he tried. By early 1943, the fog of that launch morning would feel like an opening bell. A freighter larger than a neighborhood slid under the bridge with containers stacked like a city. "We used to build them one piece at a time," she said. He squinted at the ship, at the cranes ashore, at the photographs on her living room wall where floodlights burned through fog. "Did you make one?" he asked. She considered the question carefully, as if it were a seam that deserved the right heat and a steady hand. "We made many," she said. "And they got where they were going." The boy nodded, as if he understood everything, and tossed a pebble. Circles ran out from the splash until they touched the pilings and broke cleanly, and then the bay looked flat again. But for a moment you could see how one small act becomes many, how 1,000 hands can shape the surface of a world. The factory that built a ship every 4 days did not last as a factory. It lasted as an idea, that when time itself is the enemy, people can learn to divide it, share it, and win. Richmond's shipyards, 4 of them by then, ran on a 24-hour heartbeat. The ships left, the cranes were lowered, the lights dimmed. And still, across ocean lanes and hospital corridors, across unions and nurseries, and the busy grammar of a Gantt chart, the lesson kept arriving, on schedule. Whistles blew at 700, 15 to 300. Men and women flowed in tides through gates where badge checkers stood on wooden crates calling numbers. The cafeterias learned to pour coffee like ammunition, fast and steady. Bus lines, hastily strung, coughed up workers from Oakland Vallejo, and the makeshift boomtown of Richmond itself, where prefab neighborhoods sprouted like corn. Baby carriages rolled past cranes. English rubbed elbows with Spanish, Italian, Swedish, Japanese American citizens, who had brothers in uniform and cousins in camps. Black families from Louisiana and Texas arrived with lunches wrapped in wax paper and a patience worn thin by other gates that did not open. In the smoke and flame of the weld arcs, the faces were equal, masked, backlit, intent. A Liberty ship was simple by design. That was the point. 5 holds, a single screw turned by a triple expansion steam engine that could push 11 knots on a good day. No one would call her beautiful. The bow a little blunt, the profile boxy, deck cargo cranes stiff as knuckles. But beauty was not the demand of the hour. What mattered was that a kiloton of flour and TNT, with a few tanks chained down and a planked over top for jeeps, could cross a killing ocean and arrive. What mattered was rhythm. Steel arriving by rail from Fontana and Pittsburgh, plate bent on the press, edges plain true. Tack welds stitched in bright beads that crackled like sleet. Hull blocks creeping together until the seam was a scar you could only find with your fingertips. There was skepticism. How could there not be? Old salt yardmen muttered about the new kids and their speed tricks. About welding instead of the old faithful rivet. Welds could crack, they warned. Green crews could miss a stress point. And there were losses. Yearly ships that groaned and split in cold seas until metallurgists refined the recipes and the sequence of cuts, until inspectors with mirror and lamp crawled the seams inch by inch. But in the meantime, the fight for the Atlantic did not pause to debate. It had simply counted. Tonnage lost. Tonnage launched. And every 4 days, give or take, Richmond added another name to the tally, jotted in chalk on a foreman's board, christened by a bottle shattered at the bow, guided into water that seemed too narrow to hold so much hope. As the Peary's horn bellowed and the mist began to lift, Kaiser closed his notebook. The numbers were good. Not good enough. He watched the tug swing her stern, watched the men coil lines and the women on the pier clap in proud, numb hands. Again, he said softly, to no one in particular. The word vanished into the clangor, but it was already understood. In an age when the enemy hunted at night and war measured courage in deadweight tons, repetition was a kind of prayer. Could they keep this pace? Could a nation learn to treat shipbuilding like stamping cars? In the echo of that launch, with seawater still streaming from the scuppers, the question hung in the chilly air unanswered. And necessary. December 3rd, 1942. Graveyard shift, Richmond Shipyard Number side. 3, Dialna. Wind came hard off the Carquinez Strait, a cold knife that drove smoke flat and sent paper hats skittering along the ways. Floodlights stitched white lanes through the rain. Mabel Ortega's mast glass fogged and cleared with each breath, as she guided her rod along a seam that glowed like a line of sunrise. Easy, her leadman called over the hiss. Stitch, skip, let it cool. We were not building a stove. Then to Undine. On the next scaffold tier, a riveter from Mare Island, one of the old hands drafted to teach, shook his head. "Welds," he muttered to a buddy. "Give me a bucket of hot rivets and 4 good men. I'll give you a joint you can trust in winter." His friend jerked his chin toward the poster tacked to a beam. "Welding saves time. Time saves ships. Trust is whatever floats to Liverpool," he said. The struggle wasn't just belief. It was weather, steel, bodies and clocks. The plate shop ran hot, then stalled when a railcar missed its window. Cranes swung to nowhere, waiting. On the assemblyways, 4 men with stopwatches measured steps the way quartermasters measured beans. A planner with a pencil behind his ear knelt in a puddle and chalked a new path. Shift the tack crews start 10 minutes earlier, slide the fitters past the pipe men, pull the electricians before the deckhouse closes. "We're tripping over ourselves," he said, half to the soaked concrete. "We need lanes." December 20th, the whistle at 2300 swallowed the yard like a wave. Workers poured from the gate, and another tide flowed in. A woman in a Letterman jacket under her oilskin, Stanford class of 41, now a draftsman, stopped in the lee of a transformer and scanned a clipboard. "Unit 5 bulkhead is short 3, she told a runner. "Grab the floaters from 7. He sprinted into the rain. Behind them a siren hiccuped twice. Accident. A fitter's boot had slid on a rung. He went 2 stories but caught a cable with his armpit and lived, cursing in a steady stream as the riggers rigged a stretcher. Christmas came in the cafeterias as pies that steamed and coffee that did not end. A chorus from the Union Hall, voices rough with smoke, sighed through, "I'll be home for Christmas," while a child in a stroller clapped at the bright hard hats. On the bulletin boards, notices curled. Boilermakers at 36 meeting. Day shift. In the lines and locker rooms, the talk could turn sharp. Who got the better jobs? Whose hands were trusted with inspection stamps? Why pay envelopes for some were lighter than others? A black rigger from Baton Rouge pulled his gloves snug and told the white checker, "Stamp me where you stamp the rest." "I swing the same steel." The checker nodded slowly and set the ink. January 16th, 1943. A rainless cold that stabbed to the bone. Word leapt yard to yard faster than the switch engines could shove. In Portland, a tanker had cracked open at the dock like a loaf of bread torn wrong. "Schenectady," someone said, "broke clean in 2. Men leaned on their torches, listening to rumors dressed as facts. To the old riveters who said, "Without savor, I told you so." In the planning shed, an engineer drew a neat line across a chalk hull and talked about brittle fracture, about cold steel, and sharp corners that made stress sing. "It's not the idea that fails," he said, tapping chalk against the board. "It's how we cut and how we cool." Night after night, inspectors with mirrors and hammers crawled the seams, tapping, listening. A bad bead had a way of sounding guilty. Mabel learned to grind out proud metal and lay it in again, patient as lacework. "Your welds look like fish bones," her leadman said once, not unkind. "Make them look like a smooth river. No fish, no bones." She smiled in the mask where he couldn't see. In the locker, she rubbed liniment into her wrists and read a clipping from the Oakland Tribune about a ship that made the crossing and came back again with her decks stained with coffee and diesel and salt. The last line said simply, "More." But speed took its price in other currencies. The nursery lights stayed on past midnight, a row of warm eyes in the storm, where children slept while their mothers burned rod. Kaiser's clinics, clean rooms with bright windows, wrapped bandages and stitched cuts, and, more quietly, kept small coughs from becoming big ones. "We can't throw away the people to save the ships," the new doctor told a yard boss, stethoscope cold against his throat. The boss stared at the ceiling and counted seconds between crane bells. January turned to February. The bay weather shifted from knives to wet wool. A Liberty on the ways refused to fit. 2 prefab blocks argued at their seam like stubborn neighbors. Fitters cursed the drawings and then themselves. "We built her perfect," one said, unbelieving. The draftsman from the transformer leaned in and traced with her finger. "Perfect in 2 different rooms," she said. "Bring the dogs and clamps."